19 years old, and Mercy Vane owned nothing in the world but the clothes on her back, a carpet bag with 2 dresses folded inside it, and $14.75 sewn into the lining of her coat. It was her uncle, Silas Vane, who had put her out onto the road that autumn, not with cruelty exactly, but with the cold, practiced ease of a man clearing an account he no longer wished to carry, because his new wife had decided that a niece with no dowry and no family land was a debt, not a daughter. Mercy took what she had, walked 3 days into the town of Hollow Creek, Montana Territory, and there, at a tax auction on the courthouse steps, she spent $10 of her 14 on an abandoned trading post called Fort Kestrel, a sagging ruin of gray timber that the whole town had long ago written off as worthless, cursed even, a place where no one had done honest business in over 20 years. The men on the steps laughed when she raised her hand. They called it a fool's purchase, money thrown into a grave. What none of them knew, what even Mercy herself did not yet know, was that somewhere beneath that collapsing roof, behind a wall no one had opened in 2 decades, sat a sealed vault holding a secret that would not only rewrite her own fate, but quietly settle a debt the whole town had been living under without ever knowing its name. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Mercy Vane. If you have ever been told that you were worth less than the trouble it took to keep you, or if you're watching tonight from a town that the world seems to have forgotten, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, because this story was written for you. Mercy had not always been without a place in the world. She had been born in 1868 in a small settlement in the Dakota Territory, the only child of Thomas Vane, a quiet, careful man who had spent his younger years as a clerk for the fur trading companies that once threaded the northern plains with wagon roads and river posts. Her mother had died delivering her, and so it had been her father alone who raised her, and he had raised her the way he had been trained to think, which was to say, with numbers, with ledgers, with the patient discipline of a man who believed that everything in the world, if you looked closely enough, could be accounted for. He taught her to read before she was 5, not from picture books, but from the columns of an old trading ledger, showing her how a single entry, a debt owed or a debt paid, could tell the whole story of a person's character if you knew how to read it rightly. He taught her, too, the quieter skills that came from a life spent among trading posts and traveling men. How to mend a torn coat so the seam would not show, how to patch a leaking roof with pitch and canvas, how to keep a fire low and steady through a long winter night, how to barter fairly even when hunger made a person's judgment cruel. But more than any single skill, he taught her a way of seeing. He used to tell her, when they passed abandoned cabins and rusted outposts on their travels, that nothing in this world was ever truly worthless, only unattended, and that most of what people threw away had simply never been looked at by the right pair of eyes. She was 11 when he died of a lung fever that swept through their settlement one bitter February. And in the weeks after his death, it was this lesson, more than any other inheritance, that she carried with her, because it was the only one nobody could take. After her father's death, Mercy went to live with her father's younger brother, Silas Vane, who kept a modest but respectable dry goods store in the town of Hollow Creek, a young settlement built up along a bend in the Yellowstone River, where cattle ranches were beginning to spread across the grass in the years after the buffalo herds thinned. Silas was not an unkind man in those early years, and his first wife, Mercy's Aunt Ruth, had loved her fiercely, the way a woman loves a child who reminds her of a brother she has lost. Mercy grew up behind the counter of that store, learning the trade the way she had learned everything else, by watching closely and asking good questions, and by the time she was 16, she could keep the store's books better than Silas himself, could spot an error in a column of figures at a glance, could mend a torn awning or reset a cracked window frame without being asked twice. She was, by every account the town could give, a capable and gentle young woman, quick to help a customer count out coin when their hands shook with age, quick to sit with old widow Callahan on slow afternoons and listen to her stories twice over without complaint. She did not dream of anything grand. She dreamed only of steadiness, of a roof that did not leak and a ledger that always balanced, because she had learned early that steadiness was the rarest and most valuable thing a life could hold. Then Aunt Ruth died of a fever in the spring of Mercy's 18th year, and within a season Silas had remarried a woman named Ottilie Marsh, a widow from the railroad town to the east who arrived in Hollow Creek with sharp opinions and a sharper sense of what belonged to whom. Audley was not cruel in her words, not at first. She was cruel in the slow, deliberate way of someone rearranging furniture until the person she wishes to remove simply no longer fits in the room. She told Silas, quietly and often, that a niece with no inheritance and no prospects was a burden on a household that needed to think of its own future, that the store's earnings would go further feeding 2 mouths instead of 3, that people would talk less kindly of a young, unmarried woman living under a man's roof who was not her father. Silas, who had never in his life been strong enough to stand against a determined voice in his own kitchen, began, over the course of that year, to grow distant, to find small faults, to speak of Mercy's presence as an arrangement rather than a family. And so it was that on a gray morning in September of 1887, with the harvest wind already carrying the first bite of winter down from the mountains, Silas Vane told his niece, without quite meeting her eyes, that it was time she made her own way in the world, and that he could no longer keep her. He gave her, in the end, $14.75, the balance of wages he claimed she was owed for her years behind the counter, though both of them knew it was closer to charity than payment, a sum meant to ease his own conscience more than to secure her future. Mercy did not argue. She had learned from her father that arguing with a closed ledger accomplished nothing. What mattered was what you did with the balance you were given. She sewed the money into the lining of her coat, packed her 2 dresses and her father's small brass compass into a carpet bag, and walked out of the only home she had known since childhood with her spine straight and her eyes dry. Because she had also learned, somewhere in those years, that dignity was the one thing a person could keep even when everything else was taken. She spent 3 days on the road, sleeping in a barn loft with the farmer's blessing one night and beneath a wagon the next, before she reached the center of Hollow Creek proper on the morning of the county tax auction, drawn there not by any plan, but by the small crowd gathered on the courthouse steps and the promise, however faint, of finding somewhere, anywhere, to stand still. It was there that she heard the auctioneer, a red-faced man named Purnell, call out the particulars of a property that had sat unclaimed on the county rolls for 11 years running. Fort Kestrel, once a fur and provisions trading post on the old river road, condemned as a public nuisance. Minimum bid $10, sold as is, no warranty of soundness. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Someone said the old fort was haunted, that its last owner, a trader named Elias Kestrel, had vanished into the mountains one winter and never been seen again, leaving behind debts nobody had ever managed to untangle and a building nobody had ever managed to sell. Mercy, listening from the edge of the crowd, felt something in her father's old teaching stir awake in her chest, that quiet certainty that nothing was worthless, only unattended, and before she had fully decided to speak, she heard her own voice call out $10, and the gavel came down before anyone thought to bid against her. The walkout to Fort Kestrel took the better part of an afternoon, along a rutted river road that had clearly not seen a loaded wagon in many years, grass grown up thick between the wheel ruts, and when the fort itself finally came into view above a stand of cottonwoods, Mercy understood at once why the town had laughed. It was a low, sprawling structure of gray, weathered timber. Its palisade fence collapsed in 3 places. Its main trading hall roof caved in on the northern corner where a winter's snow had finally proven too heavy for rotted beams to bear. The wind moved through it with a low, hollow sound, like breath through a cracked instrument, and for a moment, standing there with her carpetbag heavy in her hand and the last light going golden thin across the grass, Mercy allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had done, spending nearly all the money left to her in the world on a building that even the crows seemed to have abandoned. But she had also learned from long practice that despair was a debt best paid down slowly, one small action at a time. And so instead of weeping, she simply set down her bag, found a length of dry pine for kindling, and set about making the one room still holding its roof fit for a night's sleep. It was on her second morning at the fort, while she was clearing broken glass and rat-chewed canvas from what had once been the trading hall's back office, that she found the first thread of the mystery that would come to define the rest of her life. behind a warped floorboard, wedged so tightly it took her the better part of an hour with a flat iron bar to work it loose, she found a small tin box, rusted nearly through, containing a single leather-bound journal whose pages had gone brittle and spotted with age, but were, remarkably, still legible in a careful, slanting hand. The journal belonged, the first page made plain, to Elias Kestrel himself, and its entries, dated across the final 2 years before his disappearance in the winter of 1866, described a man increasingly troubled not by the failure of his trading post, which had in fact been thriving, but by a growing unease about a business partner, a silent investor named Josiah Marsh, who had begun, in Kestrel's careful words, to press him toward practices that Kestrel considered dishonorable toward the very people who had built the post's fortune. The Absarka families and river traders whose furs and goods had flowed through Fort Kestrel for a decade under agreements of fair and equal trade. Mercy read that journal by candlelight for 3 nights running, and with each page her understanding of the fort's history and of her own family's history began to shift beneath her like ice going soft in spring. Elias Kestrel had written, in an entry dated only weeks before the final one, that he intended to set aside a portion of the post's accumulated wealth, kept safe against just such a dispute, into what he called a vault of accounts, sealed and untouched, to be held in trust until the debts owed to his trading partners could be honored in full, regardless of what became of him or his business. The final entry in the journal was shorter than the rest, hurried, the ink smeared as though written in haste or in cold. It said only that Marsh had grown desperate, that Kestrel feared what a desperate man might do, and that he was leaving that same night for the agency post upriver to secure witnesses to the true accounting of the post's affairs, so that no one could later claim the debts had never existed. Elias Kestrel never returned from that ride. The town's old memory, the story Mercy had heard laughed about on the courthouse steps, held that he had simply vanished into a blizzard and been lost, his fort left to rot as a monument to a failed venture and a man too proud to manage his own affairs. But sitting in the cold trading hall with his journal open on her knees, Mercy understood, with a certainty that settled into her stomach like a stone, that there was another story entirely, one that a man named Josiah Marsh had likely worked very hard to make sure nobody ever read. The name struck her with a force she had not expected, because Marsh was the maiden name of her own aunt by marriage, Ottilie, the very woman who had pressed so patiently and so successfully for Mercy's removal from her uncle's household. It could have been coincidence, she told herself at first, a common enough name in a territory full of settlers from every corner of the East. But the more she read and reread the journal's careful, worried entries, the more she began to feel that the threads of her own recent misfortune and this decades-old vanishing were not separate stories at all, but 2 ends of the same long rope. She spent the following days searching the fort with a new and deliberate purpose, no longer simply clearing debris, but hunting for the vault Kestrel's journal had described, and she found it at last in the root cellar beneath the trading hall's back storeroom, a low, iron door set into the stone foundation itself, nearly invisible beneath decades of fallen earth and rotted grain sacks, its hinges rusted nearly solid, and its lock long since seized shut by time and damp. It took her 4 days of careful, patient work, heating the old iron with coals carried down from her fire and working oil she rendered from bacon fat into the mechanism a little at a time, before the lock finally gave way with a groan that seemed to echo through the whole silent fort like a held breath finally released. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow, against all reasonable expectation, kept the damp at bay, Mercy found what Elias Kestrel had left behind. There were ledgers of full decades' worth, recording in exacting detail every transaction the Post had ever made, every debt owed and paid, including a long and specific accounting of monies and goods owed to nearly 40 Absarka families and independent traders, debts that, by Kestrel's own final reckoning, Josiah Marsh had been siphoning off for his own use under the cover of the Post's ordinary business, leaving the true creditors unpaid while claiming, in his own separate correspondence with the Territorial Land Office, that the Post itself was failing and its debts uncollectible. Beneath the ledgers, in a smaller iron chest, Mercy found the wealth Kestrel had set aside to make those debts right: a cache of silver coin, a handful of gold dust in seal pouches, and a bundle of promissory notes and trade credits that, even discounted generously for 20 years of inflation and dust, represented a sum larger than anything Mercy had ever imagined holding in her own two hands. And folded at the very bottom, sealed in wax that had somehow held, was a letter addressed simply to whoever should find this vault, written in Kestrel's own careful hand, explaining his intentions plainly: that this money belonged first and foremost to the families his post had wronged through Marsh's dishonesty, and only after those debts were settled could any remainder be considered the rightful property of whoever restored the post to honest use. Mercy sat for a long while in that cold cellar with the letter in her lap, the single candle guttering low, and felt for the first time in many months something that was not quite grief and not quite hope, but some third thing, harder to name, that felt very much like purpose. Word travels quickly in a small territory, and it did not take long for Hollow Creek to learn that the strange young woman who had bought the cursed old fort for $10 had been seen hauling old iron chests and ledgers out of its cellar, and that she had begun. With the help of a local blacksmith, she paid in mended harness leather rather than coin, to make careful, quiet inquiries about the old Kestrel trading accounts. It was not long, either, before that word reached Cornelius Bragg, the president of Hollow Creek's only bank, a man whose family fortune, it turned out upon careful examination of the county's oldest land records, had been built substantially on properties and notes purchased cheaply from the very Marsh family, whose fraud Mercy was slowly uncovering, and who therefore had every reason in the world to see the whole matter of Fort Kestrel quietly buried once more. Bragg came to the fort himself on a cold morning in October, arriving in a fine buggy that looked entirely out of place against the fort's weathered timbers, and he was, at first, all smiling condescension, offering to buy the property back from her for $50, a sum he clearly believed would seem a fortune to a penniless girl. When Mercy declined, politely but without hesitation, his tone shifted, and he began instead to speak of legal technicalities, of a supposed unresolved lien on the property dating back to the original Kestrel bankruptcy proceedings, a lien he claimed, without producing any document to prove it, that his bank now held and intended to enforce, which would allow him to seize the fort and everything within it under color of law. He also let slip, in his irritation, more than he perhaps intended, referring once to Josiah Marsh as though the two families' business had long been intertwined, and reminding Mercy, with a thin and pointed smile, that her own Uncle Silas depended a great deal on the bank's goodwill to keep his store afloat, and that it would be a shame if that goodwill were to sour over a stranger's foolish attachment to a worthless ruin. Mercy understood, listening to him, that Bragg was not merely protecting an old family secret, but was frightened, in the particular way of men who have built their comfort on ground they know to be unsteady. And she understood, too, that fear made him dangerous in exactly the way a cornered animal is dangerous, unpredictable and quick to strike before it can be reasoned with. She did not sleep easily in the nights that followed. She kept the ledgers hidden beneath a loose hearthstone each evening, wrote out careful copies of the most important entries in Kestrel's letter itself, and sent those copies, by a young writer she trusted named Abel Finn, to the Territorial Land Office in Bozeman, and to a circuit judge she had heard spoken of with respect even by people who disliked lawyers on principle, so that no single fire, no single act of desperate men, could erase what she had found. It was Abel Finn, in fact, who first thought to ride out to the Absarica encampment along the Stillwater to ask, gently and without presumption, whether any families still remembered the old post and its dealings. And it was there that Mercy's slow work of restoration truly began to take its shape, because the families remembered a great deal more than the town of Hollow Creek had ever cared to ask them. An elder named Two Elk Woman remembered her own grandfather speaking of Elias Kestrel as an honest man among few, and remembered, too, the winter the post payments simply stopped arriving with no explanation given, a winter that had cost several families dearly in goods they had already delivered on trust. When Mercy rode out herself, nervous and plainly dressed, carrying Kestrel's ledgers and his letter, and explained what she had found and what she intended to do with it. She was met not with the suspicion she had half expected, but with a quiet, careful attention that reminded her, powerfully, of her own father listening to a column of figures for the story hidden inside them. The reckoning, when it came not through violence, but through the same patient instrument Mercy had always trusted most, the plain and undeniable weight of an honest account. The circuit judge, presented with Kestrel's original ledgers, his sealed letter, and Mercy's careful copies corroborated by the testimony of Absarca families and traders whose own memories and family records matched the old post's entries almost to the coin, found more than sufficient cause to open a formal inquiry into the historical dealings of Josiah Marsh's estate, an inquiry that, once begun, proved impossible for Cornelius Bragg to quietly smother, however many letters he wrote, and however many old favors he called upon, because the truth, once given a proper accounting, has a way of settling its own debts. It came to light, over the following months, that Bragg's own bank had for years held certain of the old Marsh notes and properties under terms that would not survive close examination by the Territorial Banking Commission, and though no dramatic arrest ever came, no chains or courtroom spectacle to satisfy an appetite for vengeance, Bragg found himself, within the year, quietly eased out of the bank's presidency by his own board of directors, his reputation, the only currency he had ever truly valued, spent down to nothing among the very townsfolk who had once tipped their hats to him on the street. Mercy, for her part, wanted no part of vengeance and little enough of the fortune itself. Working alongside Abel Finn, and with the blessing of the circuit judge, she spent the better part of that winter and the following spring settling accounts the way her father had always taught her they should be settled, one honest entry at a time. She paid, in full and with fair interest for the years of delay, every debt Kestrel's ledgers showed owed to the Absarca families and independent traders who could be found or whose descendants could be located, a task that took her, in the end, most of the silver and gold from the vault, but left her, she often said afterward, richer than she had ever been in her life. What remained after those debts were honored. She used not to enrich herself, but to rebuild Fort Kestrel itself, not as a private trading post, but as a proper provision store and way station open to every family in the region regardless of what they could pay in a given season, a place where credit was extended on trust the way her father had once extended it, and where a hungry traveler, whoever they were, would never again be turned away for want of coin. She kept, for her own portion, only enough to see the roof properly rebuilt and to hire, at fair wages, two of Silas Vane's former apprentices who had likewise found themselves without steady work, because she remembered too well what it felt like to have nowhere to stand. As for Silas Vane, he was never publicly ruined, and Mercy, true to the quiet dignity that had carried her through every hardship, never sought his ruin. But the truth of Audley's family history, once it came to light in the territorial papers, proved a burden Silas could not fully escape, and the customers who had once filled his dry goods store began, slowly and without any single dramatic moment, to take their business elsewhere, to a rebuilt trading post along the river where a young woman with her father's steady hands kept honest books and never once forgot a face. It was said in later years that Silas came to the new Fort Kestrel himself once, quietly, in the winter of Mercy's 21st year, and stood a long while at the edge of the yard before turning around and riding back to town without ever coming inside, and that Mercy, watching from the window, said nothing to anyone about what she felt in that moment, only that she hoped, wherever he went, he found the same kind of steadiness she had spent her whole life learning to build for herself. And so, it was that a 19-year-old girl with $14.75, cast out by the only family she had left, came to spend her last $10 on a ruin the whole town had laughed at, and found within its walls not merely a fortune, but a truth that had been waiting patiently for someone willing to look closely enough to see it. Mercy Vane never forgot the lesson her father had taught her among the abandoned cabins of her childhood, that nothing in this world is ever truly worthless, only unattended, and she carried that lesson forward not as a private treasure to be hoarded, but as a debt to be paid outward, again and again, to every family and every traveler who came through Fort Kestrel's gates in the years that followed. The fort that had once stood as a monument to broken trust became, under her steady hand, a monument to the opposite, proof that an honest account, however long delayed, could still be settled, and that a girl with nothing but a coat lined in $14 and a father's careful teaching could, with patience enough, restore not only her own fortune, but the quiet faith of an entire community that had long since stopped believing such restoration was possible. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Mercy's story tonight. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it. And we'd love to know, in the comments below, about a time in your own life when you found real value in something the rest of the world had already written off, a person, a place, or a possession nobody else thought worth a second look. Stories like Mercy's remind us that dignity and patience are rarely rewarded quickly, but they are so often rewarded truly, in ways that ripple out far beyond the person who first showed the courage to hold on to them. Until next time, stay close.